Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Hello and welcome to USA Global TV and Radio. I am Tracy Cram Perkins, and our show today is Dementia Home Care. I invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, USA Global TV and Radio. I am a four-time dementia caregiving survivor and the author of Dementia Home Care, How to Prepare Before, During, and After. Joining me today is our guest, Bethmarie Fahey. During her mother's 10-year slow decline in the depths of Alzheimer's, Beth was her mother's primary caregiver. For several years, that simply meant managing her finances and overall well-being. In the last 3 years of her life, it meant daily and almost hourly care to keep her mother safe as she struggled with delusions and paranoia, all while she was struggling to work with a full-time job and keep her own physical and emotional. Welcome, Beth Marie.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you for having me.
So, tell us a little bit about how your dementia care journey started.
Okay, it started slowly. I was living with my mother at the time. We were sharing a home in Phoenix, Arizona, and I traveled a great deal for business. So I was gone probably 200 days out of the year. But I started to notice little things like I would come home and she would have misplaced something, or she would be a little confused about what she had done in my absence. But I wasn't paying a lot of attention to it. It was just like, okay, these are minor little things. Everybody forgets every once in a while. But then it started to progressively get worse. The one day in particular that kind of stuck with me was she was a very active volunteer. She volunteered for a philanthropic organization and helped run a thrift shop. And so she would go to the thrift shop 3 to 4 times a week. And one day she came back and she was in tears, and I asked her what was wrong. And she said she couldn't find the thrift shop, that she just couldn't remember where it was. So she came back home again. And that triggered some alarm bells. And I started thinking about, okay, maybe there's something else going on here. Talked to her doctor. Her doctor did, that typical kind of tests they do with the elderly about what day of the week is it, who's president. I'm going to give you a phrase or, five objects, and then I'm going to ask you again what they are. She did fine on those. And so we were like, well, maybe it was just an odd occurrence. But that started happening over and over and over again. And finally, it got to the point where I was like, okay, you can no longer drive because you don't know where you're going. You keep forgetting, your directions. And I realized that I needed to be paying a lot more attention to her and couldn't leave her alone as frequently as I had been. So, and then it it seemed like once the awareness was there that this was what was going on, then it became a slippery slope of her just getting worse and worse until finally we got to the point where we were in Seattle visiting my brother, which is what we typically did every summer to get away from the Arizona heat. And when it came time for us to drive back to Arizona, he sat me down and he said, "You're not going anywhere. You can't be alone with her. You can't function. You can't do your job. You can't travel. You, excuse me, you guys are staying, you're staying here." Excuse me one second. Sorry about that. So that was the point where I moved in with my brother and sister-in-law, and which was extremely gracious of them. And the three of us decided that we were going to take care of her at home from that point on. And then it was a more rapid decline. It was about 3 years at that point where she got worse and worse. That was when up until that point, she wasn't suffering from delusions or from any of the terrors. But then it became evident that she was frightened all the time. There was a real change in her personality. She had a lot of delusions. I mean, I know you're familiar with the term, sundowner syndrome, and it worked like clockwork. The sun went down, and all of a sudden, she was off in La La Land. And so, and she was up all night. She would get up and wander around the house. So we had to do all these things that you don't think about prior to that, where we cleared pathways so there was no trip hazards for her. We put extra locks on the doors up high so that she couldn't open the doors at night because she was always trying to get out. She was always convinced there was somebody in the house who wanted to get her, so she needed to get out. And so it just for 3 years, it was a struggle trying to keep her safe and help her not be as frightened, which was difficult because, she was seeing things, and so you couldn't convince her that there wasn't somebody standing in the corner. She was sure there was. So, it took all 3 of us. I mean, I know, there is that phrase that Hillary Clinton said about, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it definitely takes a family to care for a parent with Alzheimer's.
So, at what point did you give up your job or did you continue working through all of this?
I continued working. Um, Probably not the brightest decision in the world. Though I did cut back. I went back to like 3/4 time, and I did stop traveling. At that point, I said, I can manage projects, but I can't be out on the road anymore. Um, so I would do my work. I would get up early in the morning. Fortunately, my headquarters for the company were on the East Coast. So I could get up at like 6 and get in a good solid, 3 to 4 to 5 hours worth of work before she would wake up because she was up all night. So she slept in the morning. And then, around noontime or so, she would then get up. Then that was it. My day was shot until she would go back to bed again. So it was a challenge. I was constantly sleep deprived. Um, so that was probably the hardest part about it. I mean, in retrospect, I look back and think, why didn't you just retire? But I didn't. I was like, no, I'm too young. I can't retire yet. Um, and I kept having this vision of, well, what am I going to, I know she's going to pass. And so I didn't want to give up everything because then what was my life going to be like afterwards? Um, that ended anyways because then COVID came. And so I got forced into retirement, but that's a whole nother story. Um, but yes.
So, what were the hardest moments for caregiving for you?
Oh my goodness. Other than the sleep deprivation, hardest moments physically was just, you were constantly on. I never got a full 7 or 8 hours sleep. Um, and it was, getting up in the middle of the night and just kind of wandering with her, making sure that she didn't fall. So physically, those were the hardest things. Emotionally, the hardest part was when she didn't recognize me. She knew she had a daughter, but in her mind, her daughter was a young child. And so seeing me as an adult, it didn't register. And so I would try and tell her who I was, and she would shake her head and say, "No, no, my daughter's much younger." And so that was hard knowing that she didn't really know who I was anymore. Um, and then the other really challenging moment was she did fall one night. I was not as close behind her as I probably should have been. And she fell trying to get out of the house, shaking the front door, broke her hip, went into the hospital, had to call an ambulance in the middle of the night. And they came and took her in. And of course, they needed to do surgery. And I was alone. My brother and sister in law had gone away skiing for the weekend, so they were not available. And so just sitting there in that hospital room by myself, it was in the middle of a blizzard. So I wasn't able to ask anybody else in the family to come and sit with me. It just was too dangerous. And just sitting there knowing that she was going to go into surgery any minute and not knowing if she was going to come back out of it. Um, Fortunately, she did. She survived the surgery, she survived the rehab, and she actually did extremely well. Because I was also terrified with her being in the hospital with her night terrors, being in a strange place, that she wouldn't be able to handle it. Um, but the nurses told me every single day, "Your mother is the sweetest person. We just love taking care of her." I was like, "Really? You keep her now." So, but no, she did just fine.
Did she have a change in cognition after the surgery, or was she about the same level coming out as she was going in?
Great question. And I honestly think for a little bit she was a little bit better coming out of surgery. And I don't know if it was a result of the surgery, if there was a medical component to it. I think more so that she just had so much attention. The nurses took care of her extremely well in the hospital. She then went into a rehab facility for 6 weeks. They were very attentive to her. So somebody was always talking to her, interacting with her. And so I think that kept her more engaged and kept her mind functioning a little bit better than it did when we were just at home, when she would just be sitting there maybe watching TV or not interacting because I was trying to get work done, or even if my brother and sister-in-law were home, they both worked as well. uh, my sister-in-law worked from home, so she was busy trying to work. So I think having that much attention focused on her really helped her stay more aware and more engaged. It's
Oh, that's
interesting. I
good.
hadn't really thought about that, Tracy, until you asked the question.
Well, it's been my experience to date, only my experience, that anybody that's had a surgery in my family had cognitive decline afterwards, which is why
Hmm,
I was wondering if that was universal or just my own experience. So that's really why I asked the question. Eh,
interesting. Okay.
So, okay. Also, so you had to deal with a lot of hallucinations and things like that. So,
Mhm.
where were you finding resources and what were the most helpful for you?
Okay. Her primary caregiver was a good resource, and I don't mean that to say anything derogatory towards her level of care and concern. One of the things I found out is that general practitioners, primary care physicians, do not have the expertise in this, and so they mean well. They want to help. But they don't really have the level of knowledge about what kinds of medications would be most helpful. It wasn't until she reached the point where she required hospice care and hospice got involved that I think we really got the medical assistance that was best for her. They were the people who stepped in and said, "Okay, there's drugs for this." And so they gave us different medications, and different levels of medication that we could use depending upon what the level of paranoia was. And they were also available 24/7 via phone, if we had any questions or concerns about her behavior. So that was when I felt that I really had that kind of medical support. In hindsight and in talking to other people, seeking out a doctor who is, first of all, a gerontologist, and also one who specializes in dementia or Alzheimer's, is the wiser decision. We just didn't know that. Nobody told us that. So we struggled through. Um, a couple of years later, my aunt, my mom's youngest sister, also was showing signs of dementia. And in talking to my cousin, that was my number one piece of advice: was go find the right kind of doctor so that she gets the right kind of medical care and you don't have to go through everything that my brother and I did. Um, so, and that's nothing against, like I said, nothing against our primary physician. Is just they're not trained in it. It's not something that most doctors have encountered, despite the fact that I think it's, fairly common situation for the elderly. The other place where I got the most support was through the Alzheimer's Association. Um, I discovered their caregivers support group about the last year and a half, almost 2 years of my mother's life. And that was a huge, huge help. That was where I began to learn about other things that were available. Um, but it was also just a big help to me emotionally to know I wasn't alone in this, that other people were going through the same thing. And we were each in different phases of the disease with our loved one. So there were some people whose, parents or loved one was more progressed, who can kind of share, here's what might be coming down the road. And there were people who were in earlier stages than I was in that I felt that I could help. So that gave me just a lot of just emotional relief, as well as just some solid good advice from everybody. So those were the two places that really were the greatest assistance to me.
Okay, so that leads me to my next question. Since you were in that support group, what kind of advice did you give or receive that you found the most helpful? And would you share that with the audience?
Absolutely would love to. Um, Couple of things that I discovered, both learning from other people and then also kind of discovered on my own. Um, One was, and this is probably primary for any caregiver, is you have to take care of yourself first. You're of no help to your loved one if you are exhausted, if you are, malnourished, if you're letting yourself get sick simply because you're not taking the, good care of yourself. That's a very difficult one to do when physically there are impediments to that, like not being able to get a full night's sleep. And the biggest way to do that, and this was extremely hard for me, was to both ask for and accept help. I had to learn to say, okay, guys, I'm at the end of my rope. I need to step away from this. I need somebody to step in and take responsibility for her and let me walk away. And, definitely, my brother and sister-in-law did that as often as they could. Fortunately, we have a fair amount of family in the area, so I had aunts that would step in. I had two aunts in particular, both of whom had gone through similar experiences of their own. My one uncle had had a stroke, and my other uncle also had Alzheimer's. These are both my mother's brothers. And so both of my aunts constantly literally nagged me, and I mean that in the nicest way. They'd be like, "Okay, you need to get out of the house. You need to go do something. We're coming. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. We're showing up at the house. We've got your mother for 3 hours. Leave." So I was very, very fortunate that I had family that would do that. Um, so that was a huge thing that I learned, and that was something that was echoed all throughout the caregiver support group that I was in. Everybody was reminding each other, you need to get a break. You need to get away. You can't be on call with this 24/7, 365 days a year. The other thing that I learned, and this actually I learned from my brother, um, was when the person is in one of their delusions, there's no such thing as logic. They're in their own little world, and that world is very, very real to them. I'm a very logical, analytical kind of person, and so I would try desperately to bring her back into our world, and it didn't work. She would fight me on it, literally fight me. And but I would say, "But, no, that's not right. That's not." And my brother was the one who finally said, "Stop. You're driving yourself crazy. And you're not helping her because you're only making her upset." So I learned to step into her world wherever it was. And if we were back when she was a teenager and I was her high school friend, not her daughter, I was her high school friend. Um, a common delusion she had was that she needed to go home. She needed to go home. She came from a family of 10 siblings. She was one of the older ones. And so she was constantly saying she had to go home to help her mother take care of the younger siblings. And I used to say, "Mom, you are home. This is it. There's no little ones here. It's just us." And she would argue, and I finally learned to say, "Okay, I'll take you home." We would get in the car. I would drive around the neighborhood. I'd stop at McDonald's. She loved their hot fudge sundaes, so I'd get her a hot fudge sundae. We'd sit there in the parking lot and she'd eat her hot fudge sundae. And then I would say, "You ready to go home now?" She'd be like, "Yeah." It's like, "Okay, let's go home." I would pull back into the driveway and she'd look up. She'd be like, "Oh, we're home again. This is nice." And she'd go in and she was as happy as could be. So it took 30 minutes out of my life. She was happy and she knew she was home again. So it was like, you just go with it. Don't try and fight it. Meet them where they are. And it just makes life so much easier for everybody all around.
But it's really hard to step in those shoes when you are running the logic track.
Yes, yes. And yeah, and sadly, I am one of those, you know, okay, no, this is reality, folks. We have to deal with it.
I have to say that for me was one of the hardest lessons to learn was to get into my own father's shoes and walk him through to a place of safety. And it took me a year and a half to figure that out. So bless you for your brother, helping you figure that out faster.
Oh, because I would watch him and he would just go right along with her. Whatever she'd say, he'd be like, "Oh, yeah, that's right." And I'd be looking at him, I'd be scowling at him from across the room, and he would give me this look like, "Leave it alone."
Oh, so um, what were some of the bright moments you had with your mom, and something you could laugh about, or a moment you could share together that you did together?
There were moments, couple of funny things. The one story in particular that I still chuckle over is the 4 of us were sitting watching TV one evening, and my mother looks around the room and she's like, "Oh, this is a really nice house." Now, we're living in my brother's house. She's like, "This is a really nice house." And she turns to my brother and she says, "I've decided when I die, you get to keep this house." And my brother just looked at her and went, "Oh, thanks, Mom." And so I decided to get a little snarky about it and was like, "Well, Mom, what about me? What do I get?" She says, "Oh, you can have the other house." To this day, I'm still looking for the other house. I have no idea where it is. So
Oh,
there'd be moments like that. There'd be moments where she would remember, something from her past, and she would share it. Uh, you know, Stories about she was constantly, for the most part, she kind of lived back in her teens and early 20s mentally. And so, she would share all these stories with me about meeting my dad and, and going to school and what she wore. And it was just kind of cute in a way to get some insight into who she was long before I came along. The person that I didn't know, because, she was always my mom, not my friend, in that same sense of, sharing those kinds of high school and grade school experiences. And she loved to tell stories about her siblings. So, she would come up with, Lord only knows if they were true or not. We had no idea. And for the most part, there wasn't somebody we could run them past and verify them, so we just went along with them. But we got some really funny stories about my aunts and uncles.
so was it a hard transition for you going from peer, I guess, or friend, or whoever she was? You were no longer her daughter, but you were someone else. How
Mhm.
describe the transition for you?
Um, Once I kind of got over that initial feeling of sadness that she didn't know who I was, then trying to think of how to describe it. In some ways, it was almost like a relief that I could be her friend in those moments, that we could sit there and just chat, um, and almost let go of the emotional burden of, this is my mother I'm talking to. This is my mother who has no clue where she is, or, in space or time,
Mhm.
and we're having this conversation about people that aren't here that she thinks are, um, and to just let it go and not have to be the daughter for a little while, but just simply be the caregiver. So in some ways, it was easier to separate those roles and not bind them together emotionally.
Did it give you any comfort?
Comfort.
I know it sounds strange, but
Yeah,
it
I know. I think I know where you're going with it, Tracy. And it did in a way. Um, it didn't in another way because it was sad. But it did in a way where it kind of enabled me to stay focused on the caregiving. So in that sense, it was a comfort knowing that I was giving her good care and not having to think about the emotional component of it. Like I said, I have a tendency to be a little analytical about things, and so I was kind of compartmentalizing the different functions. There were times where I could be her daughter, but there were times where I was literally just her caregiver, and that made it easier to deal with some of the more challenging situations.
So, what kind of tools okay, after you were able to get into your mom's shoes, what kind of tools did you use to walk her through her hallucinations or her delusions? What give us a scenario of you walking her through to a place of safety. You gave us one where you went for ice cream because she wanted to
Mhm.
go home, but do you have any others?
Let's see. A lot of times it was kind of distracting her and getting her to focus on something different. So, one of the things she loved to do was to look at old photographs. So, if she was getting caught up in a and these weren't terror delusions. These were just she was thinking there were things happening that weren't really happening, in the course of the day. That she thought that somebody was there that wasn't there, or that she had just had a conversation with somebody, or who she hadn't had a conversation with. I had boxes of old photographs,
Mhm.
and I could take them out and put them on the dining room table and sit down with her and have her start to go through them and tell me stories about what she was seeing in the photographs. And that would get her out of whatever the loop was that she would be in, because she would get herself in this loop of, I need to talk to my sister. I need to talk to my sister. I need to talk to my sister. And she was just here. And where did she go? And why isn't she here again? And my aunt was not there and hadn't been there. But if I'd gone out photographs and she started to look at them, then that took her mind to a different place and she got out of that loop. So that was one of the things that I would do. Um, the other thing, interestingly enough, television at times would do it. Certain shows, she loved the Golden Girls. I swear I've seen every episode of the Golden Girls at least 5 times. But I could put it on, and there was a channel that played it almost around the clock, and I'd put it on, and she would sit there, and she'd laugh, and she'd talk back to them like she was in the room with them, and she would be happy as a clam for, an hour or so watching it. And so, um, she also had a couple of movies. She loved the movie Finding Nemo. So we kept it recorded so that anytime she was getting antsy, we would put on Finding Nemo, and she would sit there and she would watch it, and she would be happy for the hour and a half that the movie played. So those were some of the things. Or I would get her something that she really liked to eat. We weren't allowing her to have alcohol anymore because we found it added to the delusions. She loved her Southern Comfort. That was her nightly routine, was she had a cocktail of Southern Comfort and a little snack. And so I would go and pour her a glass of Pepsi and get her a little bowl of pretzels and tell her this was her Southern comfort. This was her cocktail. It was cocktail time. And
Mhm.
she'd be like, "Oh, okay." She'd sit down happily and she'd sip away. And it would be funny. Every once in a while, she'd take a sip and she'd shudder and she'd be like, "Ooh, you made it really strong today." It's like, "Oh, yep. Well," so it was finding those kinds of routines in her life that still stayed with her. Like she knew she had a nightly cocktail, that was a routine. And so as long as she got that, she was pacified, she was happy.
Wonderful. Well, okay, I'm going to take us in a little different direction.
Mhm.
You had shared with me a couple of your blog posts about what it was like to survive after losing someone you've cared for. Would
Yes,
you talk about that, please?
I would be happy to. Yes, um, I have a degree in psychology, so I'm versed in grief counseling and things like that. And of course, Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 phases of grief. And I realized after mom passed and I started, to really kind of think about it and think about, what I was going through, was that when you've been a caregiver or been, strongly involved in the care of somebody with any kind of long-term ailment, whether it's Alzheimer's or cancer or anything else, that the 5 stages of grief don't apply because the reality is you've gone through them already. You've already gone through the process of being angry at the situation. You've gone through the process of denying it, that this isn't happening. You've gone through the bargaining. I mean, you've gone through all of those almost on a daily basis as you watch this person who you love slowly, and in some cases more rapidly, decline. And so at the moment that the death actually occurs, it's actually a relief because both intellectually and even emotionally at that point, that this person has been released from what has been a prison for them. Because my mom would say repeatedly when she would have moments of lucidity, she would say, "This is not the life I want to live. Just let me go. I don't want to live like this." And so when that moment came, yes, there's sadness because the loved one is gone. But there's also that strong recognition that she finally is at peace now, that she's not being tormented by all the terrors that go with Alzheimer's. And so you have that relief. But then you still have to get back into life because your life has been wrapped up in caregiving for such a long period of time. For me, it was about 3 years that you look around, and I described it as having been on a roller coaster for 3 years and suddenly it stops and you get off and you're kind of standing there looking around going, "Now what? Now what do I do?" And you go through a whole new phase of how do I now re-enter into life? And part of it is first is, you experience relief for them. Then you feel guilt. And the guilt comes in when you start to talk about when I started to make the phone calls to family members saying, that she has passed. And I can hear them sobbing at the other end of the phone and, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, why am I not sobbing? They're crying. They're unhappy. They're sad. Why do I feel relief? This isn't right. I must be a bad person. Well, I'm not a bad person. I grieved for 3 years. Uh, so it's accepting the fact that there's nothing wrong with that. So you have to kind of let the guilt go away. Then you have to kind of figure out, what do I do now? And in talking to people and in thinking about it for myself, people go in one of two directions. They either get extremely busy and they fill their life with anything and everything, all these things that you couldn't do for all those years that you were a caregiver. You're like a kid on too much sugar and you just go into a frenzy of activities. What can I do? Who wants to go to dinner? Who wants to go to lunch? There must be a play I can go see. I haven't seen a movie in 3 years. Let's go to three of them. I mean, you just find anything and everything you can possibly do. That was my path. I signed up for classes. The only thing that kind of held that in check was we were in COVID. So there was a limit to what I could do. But I signed up for every online class. I did all these things. I badgered my cousins about, well, can't we do Zoom calls? We can do Zoom calls like every day, can't we? I was probably obnoxious, but they were kind. Um, or the other is you go into isolation. You just crawl into a hole someplace, pull the covers over your head, and just sit in the dark. You've got to find a way out of either of those places because neither of those are good places to be. You can't live in this manic frenzy, and you also don't want to live in a hole anymore. So you have to find, for me, what it was I had to find a new purpose. Life had to have a new meaning because the meaning for me for 3 years was taking care of my mother. Now I had to find something that was meaningful for me, that gave me purpose, that gave me a reason to get up every day, that gave me something to look forward to, um, and then kept me out of the frenzy. And for me, that was writing. So I literally sat down and said, okay, I've always wanted to write. I had started writing a series of short stories based on fairy tales, and I was writing like a modern version of them. And I thought, well, let's go and finish those short stories that you were working on. So I did. I picked up and I thought, well, okay. I had written 3 of them and I was on my 4th character. And I discovered 3 months later I had written a book. So that then became my new purpose was, okay, I now have 300 pages of a story. I guess I better figure out what one does with this now. So, then I had focus. I mean, once, because I discovered that, as you know, Tracy, also being an author, uh, that initial getting something on paper is the beginning of the journey of being an author, not the end. And so,
Yes.
yeah. So my last 2 years have been devoted to really fine tuning in, finding an editor, finding a publishing house, all those kinds of things. And I'm happy to say that this spring it will actually be released to the public. So, but that was it. I had to find a way out. I had to find a new purpose.
So what is the title of your book?
The book is called Rapunzel's Escape, and it's a sweet romance. So,
Excellent.
kind of think Hallmark movie-ish kind of
Okay.
story.
Okay. I'll be watching for it.
Thank you.
So, in looking back on your journey, is there any lesson that you learned that you want to share with anybody?
Um, I've mentioned a lot of it, as we've gone along. The biggest pieces of advice that I give people, I say there's 3 things. One is take care of yourself, which I've already mentioned. Uh, find ways find ways to get breaks.
Mhm.
Let people in. People want to help. Let them. Don't be afraid to ask. Uh, the other is get the right kind of medical assistance. Find somebody who can give you the kind of medication that your loved one really needs. It's not fun for them to be in these terrors.
Yeah.
So, find a way to help minimize or they're not going to go away, but there are certain medications that you can give them that, will you know calm some of the anxiety that they're feeling. Um, talk to people. Find something that helps you cope. And it's different things for different people. Sometimes it's talking to people, having a buddy or two that you can just, pick up the phone or go have lunch with and just rant because there's a lot of emotions that are going on inside you. They're not all pretty. You need somebody who's willing to listen to them and is willing to let you say them and know it's not what you're saying isn't derogatory towards your loved one. You're saying them because you love them so much. You hate the situation that they're in, but it's causing a lot of turmoil in your life as well. So you've got to be able, you need a safe place where you can go and just say, this is driving me effing crazy. And have the other person just be able to say, okay, and not judge you for it. So I fortunately had two cousins and two aunts who were my sounding boards, as well as my brother. I also journaled a lot. Middle of the night when, I would be watching mom do her little circle around the living room couch, I would sit there and I would write. And I just put it on paper. It never went anywhere, but it was a way to release it. So find a release somewhere, somehow. That would be my advice.
Wonderful. Well, I didn't realize this, but we've actually run over time.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
so thank you very much for joining us, Bethmarie.
Thank you. This was wonderful. But I so appreciate you giving me an opportunity to share this, Tracy.
Thank you so much for being on. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up here then. Um, I'd like to thank our audience for spending time with us, and we Latin. Lance is the senior case manager at Enriched Life Home Care Services in Livonia, Michigan. He is also the host of the podcast All Home Care Matters, a podcast and or excuse me, on YouTube. It's on. Oh, let's try this again. It's on Apple Podcasts and a YouTube channel. Lance also was named a 50 under 50 for 2023. You can find Lance's podcast on Apple Podcasts or YouTube at All Home Care Matters. In the meantime, go over to our YouTube channel at USA Global TV and Radio and look for Dementia Home Care Playlist, where you'll find all of the past episodes. Thank you to the wonderful Dr. Jacqueline Kerbeck for all of her behind the scenes work, and thank you to our sponsors for making this possible. See you next time.